Part 1. The first meeting with the dragons. Alyssa had always known that she was different from other elves. While her people lived in the hidden forests of Valandor, protected by ancient magic and old spells, she dreamed of exploring the world beyond their borders. When the first humans arrived through the temporal rift 5 years ago, everything changed. The Council of Elders was afraid and wanted to hide, but Alyssa stepped forward and offered herself as a bridge between the two worlds. Now, at the age of 320 years, which made her young for her kind, Alyssa lived on Earth among the humans. Her silver hair fell down to her waist and her pointed ears marked her as something otherworldly. She wore simple clothes like the humans did, but she kept the ancient symbols of her people carved into a pendant she wore around her neck. She had come to Montana to find peace away from the busy human cities. The mountains reminded her of home with their tall trees and clear streams. She rented a small cabin near a town called Silverstone, and nobody bothered her much. The humans in the town thought she was just an odd woman who liked nature and wanted to be alone. One cold morning in November, Alyssa was walking through the forest near her home when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a cry of pain, deep and mournful, echoing from somewhere beyond the waterfall that marked the edge of her property. She knew that sound. It was not human. It was not any animal she had ever heard in the mountains. It was something ancient and powerful and deeply hurt. Without thinking twice, Alyssa ran toward the sound. Her elvish speed allowed her to move faster than any human could, leaping over fallen logs and branches as if they were nothing. The forest seemed to part for her, responding to her presence the way nature always did around her kind. The trees bent their branches slightly and the undergrowth cleared a path for her feet. She found him behind the waterfall, in a hidden cave that opened into a vast underground chamber. He was enormous, with scales black as midnight and eyes that glowed like amber in the darkness. Blood dripped from a wound on his left wing, and his breathing came in shallow, pained gasps. He was a dragon, though Alyssa had never seen one before. She had heard stories from the ancient elves, tales of dragons and humans waging war centuries ago, but she had thought they were just stories. The dragon raised his head when he saw her, and she could feel the power radiating from him like heat from a fire. He was ready to attack, ready to protect himself from whatever he thought was another threat. His muscles tensed, and she could see the faint glow of magic building in his throat, preparing fire as a defense. Alyssa did the only thing she could think of. She began to sing. The song was old, older than time itself. It was the healing song of her people, the melody that called to nature and asked for peace. Her voice was beautiful and pure, carrying notes that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce. The dragon froze, listening to the music. Slowly, the glow in his throat faded. His muscles relaxed. His eyes, which had been wide with fear and anger, began to close. She stepped closer to him, still singing, her voice never wavering. The dragon did not move to attack. Instead, he watched her with an expression that seemed almost grateful. Alyssa could see that he was suffering badly. The wound on his wing was infected and fever burned through his body. He needed help immediately or he would die. For the next 3 weeks, Alyssa tended to the dragon with everything she had. She used her knowledge of healing herbs and ancient magic to bring down his fever. She cleaned his wound carefully each day, applying salves made from plants that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest. She sang to him, the healing songs and the songs of hope. She brought him food, though she had to hunt more than she ever had before because his appetite was enormous. The dragon, who told her his name was Zephyr, through a strange form of communication that was more feeling and emotion than actual words, began to trust her. He shared his story with her through images in her mind. He showed her memories of flying through clouds, of his family scattered across different parts of the world, of humans with weapons chasing him and injuring him as he tried to escape. As Zephyr recovered, Alyssa realized that she could not send him away. He was intelligent and kind, despite his terrifying appearance. He had shown her gentleness in return for her care. When he finally stood on his 4 powerful legs again, his wound healed to a thin scar, Alyssa thought he would leave. She expected him to fly away and disappear into the mountains, returning to whatever dragon life looked like in this world. Instead, Zephyr turned to her and lowered his head in a gesture of respect. Images flooded her mind again, but this time they were different. He showed her visions of them flying together, of working as partners, of building something meaningful in this world where dragons were hunted and hated. He showed her his decision to stay with her. Alyssa felt tears on her cheeks as she understood what this meant. She had made her first real friend on Earth, and he was a dragon. As she placed her small hand on his smooth, warm scales, she felt the beginning of a bond that would change her life forever. She whispered his name softly, and Zephyr made a sound that could only be described as a purr, deep and rumbling and full of happiness. That night, as Alyssa watched Zephyr sleep in the large cave behind her home, she knew that her life had taken a turn she could never have predicted. She was no longer just an elf living between two worlds. She was now a guardian of something precious and rare. She was a dragon keeper, and her real purpose on Earth was finally becoming clear. The moon rose full and bright over the mountains, and in its pale light, Alyssa smiled. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. Part 2: The Red Dragon Arrives. 6 months had passed since Zephyr came into Alyssa's life. In that time, she had built a larger shelter for him near her cabin, a structure that was part cave and part wooden building, designed to give him comfort and protection. She had also begun to understand the dragon language more deeply. What had started as simple emotions and images had evolved into complex thoughts and even humor. Zephyr had a dry sense of comedy that often caught Alyssa off guard, and she found herself laughing at things only he would understand. The sanctuary she was building was becoming more real. She had quietly gathered supplies and had started exploring the vast forest land around her home, looking for places where dragons could hide and live safely. She had contacted a few trusted humans through the underground network that existed for people interested in magical creatures. A young woman named Katie had become her primary assistant, helping with logistics and keeping an eye on news reports about any strange animal sightings. Then one afternoon in May, everything became complicated again. Alyssa was in the forest with Zephyr, teaching him to hunt using more subtle methods when a new sound pierced the air. It was a dragon's cry, but unlike Zephyr's deep and resonant voice, this cry was higher-pitched and filled with such anguish that Alyssa's heart immediately clenched. Without waiting for Zephyr's reaction, she ran toward the sound, with her dragon companion following close behind. They found her in a clearing near the edge of the protected forest land. She was enormous, easily twice the size of Zephyr, with scales that burned bright red like molten lava in the afternoon sun. Her wings were spread wide, and she was thrashing on the ground, roaring in fury and despair. Around her lay the remains of what appeared to be a human camp. Tents were destroyed, equipment was scattered, and there were signs of conflict everywhere. Ember, as Alyssa would later learn her name, had been captured by poachers several weeks ago. They had trapped her using drugged meat and nets of reinforced steel, intending to sell her to a wealthy collector who dealt in rare and illegal creatures. She had been transported in a wooden cage, barely able to move, kept sedated for most of her journey. But during the last night of her captivity, something had happened. Perhaps the drugs had worn off, or perhaps her sheer will to survive had overcome their effects. Ember had woken up in that cage with her full strength returned. She had broken free with a roar that shook the very earth, and she had burned through the camp with fire and fury. She had killed 2 men in her rage, not from malice but from panic and the desperate need to escape. Now she was free, but she was also terrified, confused, and completely alone in a strange land far from her home. When Zephyr saw Ember, he made a sound that Alyssa had never heard him make before. It was a call of recognition, almost like he knew her from long ago. Ember stopped her thrashing for a moment and turned toward them. Her golden eyes, fierce and wild, focused first on Zephyr, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition bloomed. Through the strange connection she had with Zephyr, images flooded into Alyssa's mind. She saw memory, not her own but shared from Zephyr's consciousness. She saw 2 young dragons flying together across a sunset sky, laughing and playing in the clouds. She saw them as friends, companions, family even. They had been separated, scattered to different parts of the world as dragons were forced to flee human civilization and hide. Alyssa stepped forward slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace and calm. She did not sing this time. Instead, she simply spoke in the quietest voice she could manage, the voice she used to soothe frightened animals. She spoke in the dragon language that Zephyr had taught her, words that carried ancient meaning and power. "I am Alyssa," she said softly. "Zephyr's friend. I mean you no harm. You are safe now. The humans who took you, they are gone." Ember's head swung toward her, and for a moment Alyssa thought the dragon might attack. A creature this large, this powerful, and this frightened could destroy her with a single swipe of her enormous tail. But Zephyr stepped forward and made a series of deep rumbling sounds. Images flowing from him to Ember. He was telling her about Alyssa, about what she had done for him, about how she could be trusted. The tension in Ember's body seemed to ease slightly. She lay down on the ground, her massive form suddenly looking exhausted and vulnerable. Alyssa could see that she was injured in several places, where the poachers had struck her with electrical devices to keep her under control. Her wounds were not life-threatening, but they were painful and needed treatment. Katie arrived within the hour, having received an urgent message from Alyssa. When she saw Ember, the young woman nearly fainted. She had known intellectually that Alyssa was working with a dragon, but seeing one in person, one so large and powerful and real, was something entirely different. Katie stood frozen until Alyssa gently urged her forward, explaining that Ember was hurt and needed help. Together, the 3 humans and 2 dragons worked through the night. Katie brought medical supplies from her truck, and Alyssa used her healing magic to treat Ember's wounds. By dawn, the red dragon was stable and resting. Alyssa sat between her 2 dragons, exhausted but satisfied. Zephyr and Ember lay close to each other, their heads nearly touching, making soft sounds that seemed almost like conversation. Katie sat beside Alyssa, holding a cup of coffee, staring at the dragons in wonder. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Alyssa looked at her 2 dragons, these magnificent creatures that had come into her life so unexpectedly. She looked at the destroyed poacher camp that would need to be cleaned up and disposed of carefully, so no authorities would ask questions. She thought about the network of people who were beginning to believe in her mission, who were beginning to understand that magical creatures deserved protection and respect. "Now," Alyssa said firmly, "we expand the sanctuary. We make it bigger, stronger, safer. Ember needs a home just like Zephyr does. And if there are 2 dragons in this world being hunted and scared, there are likely others. We need to be ready for them." Katie nodded slowly, a smile spreading across her face. She had not expected to be part of something this significant when she had volunteered to help Alyssa. But looking at these dragons, seeing the way Alyssa cared for them and they responded to her with trust and affection, Katie understood that she was part of something bigger than herself. She was part of a mission to protect the last remnants of magic in a world that had forgotten how to believe. Part of 3. The Abandoned Egg 3. Months after Ember's rescue, Alyssa's sanctuary had grown significantly. The small cabin and single cave had expanded into a network of shelters and safe spaces hidden deep within the forest. She had hired 2 more assistants, both carefully selected people who understood the importance of keeping the dragon sanctuary secret. The sanctuary now had a hidden entrance disguised as a rock formation, storage areas for food and medical supplies, and several comfortable spaces for the dragons. Zephyr and Ember had become comfortable with each other again, falling into patterns of companionship that seemed to erase the years they had spent apart. They hunted together, flew together, and Alyssa could see that having his old friend back meant everything to Zephyr. She could read it in the way he looked at Ember, in the gentle rumbles of communication that passed between them. But Alyssa felt a void in her heart that she could not quite explain. She loved her 2 dragons with a fierceness that surprised her, but she found herself wanting to do more, to help more creatures, to expand her mission beyond just these 2 magnificent beings. That desire came to a head on a cold August morning when Katie called with urgent news. A hiker had found something strange in a remote cave system about 50 miles north of the sanctuary. The hiker had photographed it and sent the images to a cryptid enthusiast website. In those images was an egg, enormous and scaled, clearly not of any animal species known to science. Alyssa studied the photographs carefully. Her heart began to race. It was a dragon egg, but the images told her something else too. The cave where it had been found showed signs of struggle. There was blood on the rocks, deep claw marks that seemed frantic and desperate. Something had happened in that cave, something violent and tragic. Without hesitation, Alyssa prepared to go to the cave herself. Zephyr and Ember wanted to accompany her, but she convinced them to stay behind to avoid drawing attention. She took Katie and one of their other assistants, a quiet man named Robert, who had proven himself trustworthy and capable. The 3 of them drove north in Katie's truck, using GPS coordinates from the hiker's post to locate the exact cave. When they arrived at the location, Alyssa immediately understood what had happened. The cave showed signs of a dragon battle. Claw marks scored the stone walls. There were bones scattered across the cave floor, old bones and fresh ones both. And in the center of it all, partially buried in ash and dirt, was the egg. It was the size of a large boulder, with scales the color of emeralds catching the light filtering through the cave entrance. But what broke Alyssa's heart was the understanding that came to her through her connection to the dragon kind. This egg had been laid by a mother dragon who had then been hunted, possibly killed by poachers or rivals. The egg had been abandoned, left alone in this cave with no protection, no care, no hope of survival. Alyssa knelt beside the egg and placed her hands on its surface. It was cold, far too cold. The life force within it was fading, burning like a candle running out of wax. If she did not act immediately, the dragon inside would die before it ever had the chance to be born. "We have to take it back to the sanctuary," Alyssa said firmly. Right now. Moving an egg this size was no simple task. Katie and Robert worked together to create a makeshift carrier from blankets and cloth, and they carefully loaded the egg into the truck. During the entire drive back to the sanctuary, Alyssa sat in the back with the egg, her hands never leaving its surface. She sang to it constantly, the healing songs, the songs of hope and warmth. She poured her own energy into the egg, trying to stabilize the failing life force within. When they finally arrived back at the sanctuary, Alyssa immediately brought the egg to the warmest chamber. With Zephyr and Ember's help, she created a nest from stones warmed by carefully controlled fires. She surrounded the egg with heated blankets and water bottles that had been warmed. She continued to sing, pouring her elvish magic and her own life force into the dragon growing within. For the next several weeks, Alyssa barely left the egg's side. She slept beside it, her hands always in contact with its warm surface. She sang to it, told it stories about the world it would enter, promised it a life of freedom and safety and family. She shared her own memories with the egg, showing through her magical connection the visions of mountains and forests and the sky spread wide with endless possibility. Katie and Robert took turns bringing her food and water, watching as their leader slowly became more and more linked to the unborn dragon. They could see the connection growing, the bonds forming between Alyssa and the creature inside that egg. It was clear that when this dragon hatched, it would not be just Alyssa's ward. It would be her child in every way that mattered. And then, on a night when the moon was full and the stars seemed brighter than usual, something shifted. Alyssa felt it through every fiber of her being. The egg's shell began to crack. Small fissures appeared across its surface, glowing faintly with magic. The life force inside, which had been so dim and struggling, suddenly blazed bright like a renewed fire. The egg hatched slowly over the next several hours. Alyssa supported the hatchling through each stage, using her magic to soften the shell to ease the passage. And finally, as the sun rose over the mountains, a small emerald-scaled dragon emerged from the egg. The hatchling was no larger than Alyssa's torso, delicate and wet from its emergence, its scales shimmering like polished jade. The moment the hatchling's eyes opened, they focused on Alyssa. The connection between them was instantaneous and profound. The small dragon opened its mouth and made a sound that was more like a chirp than a roar. Alyssa felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she lifted the hatchling into her arms. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world. My name is Alyssa, and this is your home. You are safe now. You will never be alone." The hatchling, whom Alyssa named Spark, snuggled against her chest and made that chirping sound again. Within minutes, Zephyr and Ember came to investigate, and the older dragons greeted the newcomer with gentle acceptance. Spark seemed to understand instinctively that these dragons were her family, her protection, her future. As Alyssa sat surrounded by her 3 dragons, watching the sunrise paint the sky gold, she understood that her mission was far from over. This egg had been meant to find her. Spark was meant to be here, and there would be others. There would always be others who needed saving, who needed a place where they could belong. The sanctuary had become more than just a refuge. It had become a family, a home for creatures that had been cast out by the world. And Alyssa, the elf who had come to Earth as a bridge between worlds, had found her true purpose at last. Part 4, The Network Grows. By the end of the first year, Alyssa's sanctuary had become known among certain circles. Not openly, not to the general public, but to those who believed in magic and understood the value of protecting endangered species that the world did not officially acknowledge existed. Word spread through underground networks of cryptid enthusiasts, animal rights activists, and people who had experienced strange encounters they could not explain. Alyssa began to receive visitors, carefully vetted individuals who came to see the dragons and to offer their help. Some came as volunteers, willing to work for free because they believed in the mission. Others came with resources. One man named David brought veterinary knowledge and helped her develop better health protocols for the dragons. A woman named Nicole brought construction expertise and helped expand the sanctuary's buildings and shelters. Spark had grown quickly, as young dragons do, and by her second birthday she was as large as Alyssa's entire body. The hatchling had become Alyssa's constant shadow, following her everywhere with an affection that was almost dog-like. Spark would purr when Alyssa stroked her scales, and she would sleep curled around Alyssa's bed every night. The bond between them was something extraordinary, something that transcended the typical predator and prey relationship between species. Zephyr and Ember had become more comfortable sharing the sanctuary with others. They had learned to trust the small circle of humans who had proven their dedication to the dragon's welfare. They even began to understand that this network of people was working to protect them all, that humans were not universally their enemies. But as the sanctuary grew, so did the dangers. Word reached the sanctuary through Katie that several government agencies had become interested in the reports of dragon sightings in the Montana wilderness. A National Geographic journalist had been asking questions about unusual animal activity in the region. More concerning, a private collector named Mr. Gordon had begun quietly offering rewards for information about the dragons. He was willing to pay significant sums to anyone who could help him locate and capture them. Alyssa called an emergency meeting with her core team. They gathered in the main sanctuary hall, a large underground chamber that had been expanded and reinforced over the past year. 20 people sat around a long table, all of them committed to protecting the dragons, but all of them worried about what was coming. "We cannot hide forever," Alyssa said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of concern. "The world is starting to notice. Soon we will have to make a choice. We can try to stay hidden, keep the dragons as a secret that only we know about. Or we can go public, control the narrative ourselves before someone else does it for us." The discussion that followed lasted hours. Some wanted to maintain secrecy, to move the dragons to a more remote location, perhaps even to a private island or protected land far from civilization. Others felt that hiding was ultimately futile, and that the only way to truly protect the dragons was to reveal their existence to the world and fight for legal protections. Robert made a point that seemed to resonate with everyone. The more people who know about the dragons, the harder it becomes for hunters and collectors to act in secret. If the dragons become famous, become known and loved by millions of people, then harming them becomes a crime against the public, not just a private matter between hunters and prey. Alyssa listened to all perspectives and then she made her decision. "We go public," she said firmly. "But we do it carefully with planning and strategy. We tell the story of the dragons, of their intelligence and emotion and their desire to live peacefully. We show the world that these are not monsters. They are creatures worthy of love and protection." Over the next several months, Alyssa's team carefully began the process of introducing the dragons to a selected few media representatives. They filmed videos of Zephyr, Ember, and Spark in their natural state, showing their intelligence, their playfulness, their capacity for affection. They reached out to environmental organizations and animal welfare groups, building alliances with powerful institutions that could help protect the dragons legally. The breakthrough came when a famous documentary filmmaker named Susan agreed to work with Alyssa. Susan had spent her career making films about endangered species, and she was immediately captivated by the dragon story. Over the course of several months, she and her team filmed a documentary titled The Last Dragons Among Us. During this time, Alyssa also received visitors from her own people. The Elf Council, having been made aware of what she was doing through their own channels, sent an official delegation to assess the situation. They arrived at the sanctuary one autumn day. 3 ancient elves dressed in traditional garments adorned with silver and jewels. The lead elf was an elder named Celeste, who had lived for over 5,000 years. When she saw the dragons, and especially when she witnessed the bond between Alyssa and Spark, her ancient face broke into a smile. "You have found your true calling," Celeste said to Alyssa. "The council feared you would lose yourself in the human world, become corrupted by their ways and their cities. But you have done something far more remarkable. You have shown that beings from different worlds can work together toward a common good. You have brought magic back into a world that had forgotten it. The elders spent a week at the sanctuary and they offered their full support and resources. They granted Alyssa official status as a representative of the Elf Kingdom's conservation efforts. They even provided magical resources that could strengthen and protect the sanctuary itself, making it more resistant to attack and more hidden from those who were not meant to find it. By winter of that year, the documentary was complete. Susan scheduled it for release in early spring, timed to coincide with the beginning of a new season and new beginnings. The footage she had captured was extraordinary. It showed Zephyr flying through clouds, his black scales gleaming in sunlight. It showed Ember and Spark playing together, racing and diving through canyons. And it showed Alyssa singing to the dragons, the magic visible in the very air around her, a glow of pure elvish power that transcended the ordinary and entered the realm of the truly magical. As Alyssa stood on the cliff overlooking her sanctuary that winter evening, watching her dragons rest peacefully below, she felt the weight of what was coming. Soon the entire world would know about the dragons. Soon the decisions they made would be scrutinized by millions of people. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with new dangers and new opportunities. But she was ready. She had Zephyr, Ember, and Spark. She had her team of devoted humans. She had the support of her own people. Most importantly, she had a purpose that burned bright within her heart like an unquenchable flame. She was going to change the world's relationship with magic, one dragon at a time. Part 5. A New Dawn, the documentary released on a Tuesday morning in March, and within hours it was trending on every social media platform. Within days, it had been viewed by over 50 million people worldwide. The reactions were instantaneous and powerful. Some people were skeptical, claiming it was an elaborate hoax or special effects, but millions more watched with awe and wonder, seeing proof that magic and dragons were real. Environmental organizations quickly mobilized. International agencies began discussions about creating legal protections for dragons as an endangered species. Governments that had dismissed reports of dragon sightings suddenly had to take the matter seriously. The conversation shifted from whether dragons existed to how they should be protected and managed. Not everyone was pleased. Mr. Gordon, the private collector, went into hiding. Several hunting organizations publicly demanded that they be allowed to capture dragons for study and preservation in zoos. Extremist groups claimed that dragons were unnatural and should be exterminated. But for every voice calling for harm, there were 10 voices calling for protection. Alyssa became famous overnight. News outlets called her the Dragon Whisperer, the woman who had bridged the gap between human and dragon worlds. Magazine covers featured her portrait alongside images of Zephyr and Spark. She received interview requests from every major news organization in the world. But more importantly, she received messages from people around the globe who had information about other dragons. A fisherman in Scotland reported seeing a gold dragon flying over the sea at dawn. A shepherd in the mountains of Tibet described a white dragon that had saved his herd from a landslide. A woman in Australia sent photographs and video footage of what appeared to be a bronze dragon nesting in a remote canyon. The dragons that had been hiding, scattered and afraid, were beginning to emerge from the shadows as people realized they were no longer hunted alone, that there was now a global network prepared to protect them. Alyssa assembled a larger team and began planning expeditions to reach out to these dragons. Katie had become her director of operations. David, the veterinarian, took charge of dragon health and welfare. Nicole expanded the sanctuary and began building similar facilities in other locations around the world. Robert managed security and kept the sanctuary safe from those who still wanted to harm the dragons or capture them for profit. 18 months after the documentary's release, the United Nations formally recognized dragons as a protected species under international law. Member nations agreed to establish protected territories where dragons could live safely and without fear of persecution. Alyssa was invited to speak before the United Nations General Assembly, an honor unprecedented for someone so young, even by human standards. She stood in that great hall, surrounded by representatives from nearly 200 nations, and she spoke passionately about coexistence, about the possibility of different species living together in harmony, about the value of beings that were different and strange and wonderful. She spoke about Zephyr, about how his intelligence and kindness had forever changed her understanding of what it meant to be connected to another living creature. "Dragons," she said, her voice clear and strong, "are not monsters. They are not threats. They are artists and thinkers and beings capable of profound love and loyalty. They have watched humanity grow and change over thousands of years. They have always been here, hiding, hoping that one day we would be wise enough to share the world with them. Today, I believe that day has come." The applause lasted for over 5 minutes. By the 5th anniversary of Alyssa's first meeting with Zephyr, the world had transformed. There were now over 300 dragons living in protected sanctuaries spread across 6 continents. Young scientists studied dragon behavior and cognition, publishing papers that expanded human understanding of intelligence itself. Artists and musicians created works inspired by the dragons. Children grew up knowing that magic was real, that it lived and breathed and flew through the sky with mighty wings. Spark had grown into a magnificent dragon, her emerald scales now shimmering with hints of gold in the sunlight. She had chosen to stay with Alyssa at the main sanctuary, serving as an ambassador for dragon-human relations. She appeared in documentaries and educational videos, showing children around the world that dragons were not creatures to be feared, but creatures to be understood and loved. Zephyr had become a teacher to other dragons, helping newly rescued dragons adjust to the sanctuary and understand that they were safe. He had mentored 3 young dragons that had come to Alyssa through her expanding network. He had also become something of a grandfather figure to many of the dragons, and his presence alone seemed to calm frightened or traumatized creatures. Ember had taken charge of dragon populations in other sanctuaries, traveling back and forth between facilities to help coordinate care and protection efforts. She was less comfortable with humans than Zephyr, but she had come to understand and appreciate those who worked for the dragon's well-being. She had even played a crucial role in rescuing the mate she had been searching for on that distant day when Alyssa first found her wounded in a cage on a night, 5 years to the day from when Alyssa first heard Zephyr's cry of pain. She stood on the same cliff where they had watched the first sunset together, but now she was not alone. Zephyr stood beside her, his massive head lowered so that Alyssa could rest her hand on his snout. Ember and Spark lay nearby, contentedly watching the 2 suns set the sky ablaze with colors that seemed to have no names. Katie approached from the sanctuary building carrying a communication device. "The team in Norway just confirmed that the silver dragon they found has been stabilized," she reported. "And the sanctuary in Kenya is ready to receive the 2 bronze dragons we rescued from that animal trafficking ring." Alyssa nodded, listening to the reports, processing the information. But her mind was not entirely on the practical matters. Instead, she was reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the moment she heard Zephyr's cry for help and chose to answer it. She thought about how one act of compassion had grown into a global movement. She thought about how she had come to Earth as a bridge between her world and humanity's world, never imagining that the bridge would be built not through formal diplomacy or political negotiations, but through a simple connection with a wounded dragon who had chosen to trust her. Zephyr turned his great head to look at her, and she felt the familiar warmth of his presence in her mind. He showed her images of all the dragons under their care, the countless dragons they had saved and would save in the future. He showed her a vision of a world where dragons flew openly in the sky, where humans looked up and smiled instead of reaching for weapons. He showed her hope. "Thank you," Alyssa whispered to him. "Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for showing me my purpose." Zephyr responded with a rumble that sounded almost like laughter. Through their connection, he sent back his own message. "Thank you for being brave enough to help a stranger. Thank you for building a world where dragons can belong." As the last light of the sunset faded and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Alyssa stood with her dragons, feeling the peace and rightness of the moment. She had come to Earth as an elf seeking to bridge 2 worlds, but she had discovered something far greater. She had learned that the greatest bridge between worlds was not built with words or policies or agreements. The greatest bridge was built with compassion, with willingness to help those in need regardless of their species or their appearance. It was built with love, with the choice to trust and to care. It was built by individuals brave enough to see beyond their own kind and recognize the worth in all living things. Behind her, the sanctuary glowed with warm light, a beacon of hope in the Montana wilderness. Inside were not just dragons but humans dedicated to their protection and well-being. It was a place where two species had learned to live together, to work together, to build something beautiful together. The dragons around her began to settle into their resting places for the night, their powerful bodies relaxing as they drifted toward sleep. Alyssa remained on the cliff a little longer, looking out at the vast landscape before her. The mountains stretched away in the distance, and beyond them lay the rest of the world, filled with challenges and opportunities. Tomorrow would bring new rescues, new dragons to help, new battles to fight against those who still wanted to harm magical creatures. Tomorrow would bring continued work, continued dedication, continued sacrifice. But tonight, standing with her dragons under the stars, Alyssa allowed herself a moment of pure joy. She had found her family. She had found her purpose. She had found her place in this strange and beautiful world where dragons were real and magic was possible. And that, she knew, was the greatest gift anyone could receive.